Hello, good evening everyone. What is clearer to human perception than the distinction between day and night? Surely daytime represents the realm of safety, harmony, light, radiance, proper measure, and the domain of reason and rationality, whereas the night is the realm of dangers, darkness, evil of all shapes and sizes, and the ever-threatening and destabilizing spirits of irrationality. Madness lies in darkness, for it clouds our higher faculties of logic and reason. But isn't it not true that the god Apollo, the god of light and reason and music, is also the god of divine madness and prophecy? Before Apollo was made into a philosophical plaything by later philosophers and caricatured into the Apollo of light that we have come to accept today, he was a god associated with the darkness and of night. In fact, the oracle at Delphi was known to, quote, spend the night with Apollo in a state of incubation before prophesying the following morning. The process of lying down in a sacred place, absolutely catatonic-like, was a hallmark of the god. Interestingly, it was at precisely midnight, in an attitude of incubation, that the oracle was understood to receive the divine prophetic utterances from Apollo. Orpheus, the famous poet and singer who could sway the passions of nature and all creatures with his beautiful melodies, was known as the son of Apollo. For his descent into the underworld to retrieve his beloved Eurydice is a well-known story. Perhaps this foray into the underworld was brought about in a state of incubation. In fact, Kingsley has noted that a Pythagorean wrote a now-lost poem indicating that in traveling the misty depths of the underworld, Orpheus discovered that Apollo shared the same oracular powers as the goddess Night. Associated with night, of course, is the queen of the dead, Persephone. Interestingly, another Orphic poem indicates that Apollo and Persephone made love together, a god who is reached through a state of incubation, of utter stillness and catatonia, and the goddess of death, who also manifests in stillness and immobility of the dead in a corpse-like pose. According to the ancient Mesopotamians, Samos was considered the illuminator of darkness, who is simultaneously the counterpart of the sun. This is Saturn. The planet Saturn, the most distal planet in the traditional cosmology of ancient astrology, was associated with the sun. So closely associated, in fact, that it became identical with the sun. This Saturnian influence, the husband of Persephone, the ruler of the realm of the dead, Hades or Pluto, or the Egyptian equivalent Osiris or Serapis, was paradoxically the beginning point and simultaneously the end point of the cosmic journey. As one ascends through the planetary spheres in the Mithraic mysteries, for instance, the first and the seventh is known as Ialdabaoth, who is lion-like and related to Saturn. In the ascension of the soul through the planetary spheres, this process of psychanodia, the path in the mysteries of Mithras are as follows from the Earth: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Moon, Sun, and Saturn. It is interesting that the Moon and Sun are displaced and allowed to be separated from the actual physical ordering of the planets in the solar system. The Sun and Moon receive somewhat of a central position, and they are known as the luminaries. However, it is also quite telling that each planet represents a grade of initiation by which the soul is understood to traverse the celestial realms. The Sun is understood to be just beneath the Saturn, a grade that is considered penultimate, but not equivalent to the final senior grade of Saturn. Saturn is the furthest planet in this pilgrimage through the celestial spheres. Although we have been talking of extension into the far reaches of his space externally, psychologically we need to invert the ordering of these planetary spheres and internalize them. For the lower reaches into the psyche that delve into the unconscious, the closer Saturn or Hades is reached as we approach the fundament of our psychical structure. It is here where the midnight sun is reached. As Porphyry says, quote, Pluto is the sun going beneath the earth and voyaging round the invisible world. Now what does this mean? In alchemy, this is the Solneiger, or the midnight sun that blazes in the midst of the darkness of the unconscious, in the underworld, where true prophecy resides. But it is also the shadow, the mercurial essence that is constantly shifting and changing, the darkest parts of our nature that we refuse to acknowledge or integrate, the source of the material that we require for absolute transformation and transmutation. Just like in the daytime, the visible sun is the source that nourishes us and allows the realm of being to continue becoming. In the Tamidat, an esoteric mystical text written by Persian mystic Ayn-al-Qudat, there is a distinction made between two forms of light that emanate from God as his attributes: sunlight and moonlight. Sunlight, which is paradoxically the shadow of God, representing the day, and the moonlight, which is the shadow of the sun, or night. In his work, Satan maintains his status as a fallen angel, but fallen in the sense of being rejected by the love of God. The dependence of Satan on the power of God becomes clear through the idea that the moon is visible only if the sun is in its orbit, illuminating it. Satan's separation from God becomes a lesson for all to observe and acknowledge, that God's will is ultimately unknowable, even to Satan himself. The story briefly is that Satan refused God's order to prostrate before Adam, because he saw himself as closer to God and thus superior to Adam. But in punishment, he was condemned to separation from his beloved God. Despite the proximity between God and Satan, Satan was ignorant in his true relationship with God. According to this tradition, humanity bears traits of Satan, and the purpose of the spiritual wayfarer is to address the influence of Satan in one's own life. Through the black light of Satan, and on the opposite end the light of Muhammad, God's wrath, i.e. his separation, and his mercy, i.e. the union, are represented. This black light is the light that annihilates the Gnostic, the spiritual wayfarer on the journey. The black light appears the closer one approaches God, for proximity is the relationship between Satan and God. But here reason departs the wayfarer, because no creature can conceive of the ultimate union of opposites of God's majesty, represented by his two attributes of light. What lies behind the midnight sun, exemplified in all these different accounts, was also experienced by the great magus of classical antiquity, Apuleius of Madura, in his story The Metamorphoses, which contain innumerable references to the occult and is considered the first published work of occult knowledge. And this is the Mysterium Conjunctionis, the attainment of the true self that transcends all opposition because it lies beyond it by containing both in simultaneity. This was arguably the grand work of Carl Jung, his magnum opus, which summarized all of his life's work in volume 14, the Mysterium Conjunctionis. What more definitive proof do we need that Jung himself was a Gnostic? A title he tried to deny for his entire life in order to maintain a semblance of legitimacy in the face of the ignorance of academics and scientific materialists. In 1943, Carl Jung held an impromptu seminar on the solar myths and Opicinus de Canistris. De Canistris was a 13th to 14th century Italian cleric, cartographer, and miniaturist. He is known in psychological literature as the first historical account of what is known as a paraphrenic. Paraphrenia is a mental condition that is commonly associated with schizophrenia, although it's not identical. It is characterized by paranoid delusions that may or may not present hallucinations. In this particular lecture, Jung describes how in alchemy, the sun was considered to be in a prominent position, however, it was not in a dominant position. In fact, the main point of alchemy was the union of opposites, the conjunctio of soli et lunae. And in older and more ancient traditions, which we've just alluded to, it was Saturn that was the dominant figure. Jung recalls a Navajo myth that tells of how people climbed out of the four dark underworlds underneath the earth, to come to the surface, at which time they heaved the shield up to the sky, which then became the sun. This movement from the darkness of unconsciousness to the illuminating realm of the sunlight is an analogy to the illumination of consciousness. However, there is an interesting parallel with the biblical John 1:5, where it is stated, "And the light shineth in the darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not." The fires that smolder beneath the darkness of the earth give rise to creation and illumination and consciousness. The important alchemical and astrological symbol for the sun is the circle with the point in the center, a very striking illustration of the central fire that resides in the center of the earth and also signifies the sun, the midnight sun. Jung quotes the work of Paracelsus entitled Caput de Morbis Somni, quote, "Look at Adam and Moses and others. They sought in themselves what was in man, and have revealed it in all Kabbalistic arts, and they knew nothing alien to man, neither from the devil nor from the spirits, but derived their knowledge from the light of nature. This they nurtured in themselves. It comes from nature, which contains its manner of activity within itself. It is active during sleep, and thence things must be used when dormant and not awake. Sleep is waking from such arts, for things have a spirit which is active for them in sleep." Jung considered this quote to exemplify the presence of the unconscious. The unconscious had allowed for a bifurcation of knowledge into two distinct levels. The first was the light of nature, the lumen naturae, who is man's mentor, who dwells in the prima materia, the invisible source of innate spirits, the dawn-created light where God implants the seeds of creation. Paracelsus believes that the prima materia is not analogous to the doctrine of the creatum ex nihilo, but is simply the increatum, or the uncreated. This uncreated realm is the illumination outside of revealed truth, which is illuminating in the common understanding of, let's say, enlightenment or rationality or daytime logic. This luminosity of the daytime sun, commonly associated with Apollo, necessitates the presence of a counterlight, a dark sun, also known as Sol Niger or Umbra Solis, Plutarch's lunar counter-earth of Persephone, also known as Hades. If we quickly retrace our steps to the pre-Socratics, Kingsley notes that Empedocles also believed that the, quote, fire which eventually rose up to become the sun had its origin in the bowels of the earth, but also implying that the source of daylight and illumination derives ultimately from the dark depths of the underworld. This sentiment is also echoed in Parmenides. Jung associated this black sun with the inferior aspect of the personality, the weakness that resides inside every strength, the evil in every good action, and the darkness of night that follows the brightness of day. We have earlier touched upon what resides behind this black or midnight sun. It is important to note that the shadow element associated with the illustrations of the Canistris is a gateway to the realization of the midnight sun. Behind the shadow, there lies, quote, a much greater power. And what this power is the illumination of the midnight sun. It is understood as, quote, the totality of conscious and unconscious. In the words of Jungian analyst Paul Bishop, quote, the shadow of the shadow, then, is the self. Jung's solution to the problem of the shadow, as many of you are aware, is integration. For Jung says that, quote, we cannot get rid of ourselves. We carry our body and our shadow, and everything else is as it always has been. And we can only hope to become balanced between light and shadow. That is practically all we can hope for, no more. But rather than running away from the shadow or the darkness or Hades or Persephone or chthonic elements of Apollo, Paul Bishop says, quote, the shadow-forming process is an inevitable part of the project of becoming the self. Or as Jung says, echoing Nietzsche's conception of thus spake Zarathustra, quote, for the love of mankind and for the love of yourself, of mankind in yourself, create a devil. Bishop observes that by, quote, creating a devil, one creates a means to engage with the problematic figure of the inferior man in oneself, one's shadow. For if one doesn't accept the inferior man, one is liable to become mad, since the inferior man brings up the whole collective unconscious, because nothing in the unconscious is isolated. Everything is united with everything else. This devil, interestingly, has the same ring as Ayn-al-Qudat's conception of Satan. The black light of Satan marks the approaching intimacy of the wayfarer with God, and also acts as a bulwark and protection against anyone who cannot bear to endure the union or henosis with God. It is also important to state that Jung believed that the shadow is not necessarily antagonistic, but is very much a compensatory force. As Jung goes through the seminar, indicating each of the illustrations of the Canistris, he shows the chaos that is contained within the circle of the mandala, where there is an original state of utter chaos, unordered and dark, where all things act against everything else simultaneously, a state of complete undifferentiation, a state in which the Stoic understanding of, quote, astral fate or haimarmene reigns supreme, and the four elements of earth, water, air, and fire all act relentlessly upon one another. Interestingly, the separation of the circular mandala of chaos into four equal aspects is the initiation of the ordering principle, thereby grounding the chaos into an intelligible frame. As we can see in certain images, the containment of the darker nature, the counterpoint of the illuminating sun, is barely contained. This speaks, of course, to the psychopathological state of the Canistris. As a side note, the many layerings of the mandala act as skins, giving additional protection against outside influences, but also simultaneously containing the potent and dangerously destructive effects of the contents of the mandala. Quote, the middle is missing in these images, and for this very reason, because the danger from this became so big that the monk had to draw the triple circle, i.e. the enclosure, in order to enclose the evil secret of the conflict that leads to madness, the bête noire, the hellish fire. So let figure 43 act as a warning to the curious, a warning to the wayfarer who tries to dabble into the powerful occulted, i.e. hidden aspects of nature. For the closer one approaches God, the closer one approaches madness and destruction. Recall the story of Icarus on his wax wings, who flew too close to the sun, only to finally plummet to his death. Take care for now.